Amos Thatcher, a broken old rancher waiting to die alone in the dust of the American frontier, finds unexpected purpose when a terrified deaf girl named Clementine appears on his land. She's on the run from corrupt lawmen who murdered her family and now seek to silence her forever. At first, Amos resists getting involved. He's tired, bitter, and convinced the world has no more use for him. But as he looks into the girl's frightened eyes, something long buried awakens in him. What begins as a simple act of hiding a child turns into a desperate fight for justice. When the killers come for her, Amos stands between them and the barn door, rediscovering his courage in the twilight of his life. With help from a band of federal rangers, Clementine survives and Amos dies not as a forgotten hermit, but as a hero. His final day becomes the one that gave his life meaning. In protecting an innocent soul, he redeems his own. And Clementine, though she cannot speak, carries his memory into the world with a message. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust a stranger. Amos Thatcher had been dead inside for nearly 30 years. His body still moved, albeit slower with each passing winter, but his heart had long since stopped believing in anything worth living for. He was a relic on a forgotten piece of land in the high country of Wyoming, tucked between jagged ridgelines and abandoned cattle trails. His ranch, once a place full of laughter and purpose, had grown quiet, save for the groan of the wind through broken shutters and the distant howl of coyotes. People in town called him a ghost, a bitter old man who refused visitors who hadn't stepped foot beyond his fence line in over a decade. And maybe they were right. The man Amos used to be had died alongside his wife, Sarah, and their little girl, Emma, taken too young by fever and left buried on a hill behind the house. Now, at 71, Amos lived in silence, speaking only to his horse and the wind rising each day, just to watch the sun burn across the sky and remind him that he was still breathing. But even that habit felt more like a ritual of waiting for death, for peace, for something to end the long ache of survival. Each morning, Amos sat on the edge of his porch with a chipped mug of black coffee, watching the world awaken around him, like a man studying a place he no longer belonged to. The mountains turned gold in the early light. The wind stirred dust across the dry fields, and the same hawk circled the same dead tree, but none of it stirred anything in his chest. He wasn't afraid of dying. In truth, he welcomed it like an old friend who was just taking too damn long to arrive. He had no family, no visitors, no letters, no calendar. Just a rifle leaning against the wall, a worn rocking chair, and the distant rhythm of silence that wrapped around his land like a shroud. He'd already dug his own grave beside Sarah, and Emma marked with a stone and a hand-carved cross. It gave him comfort to know that when his heart finally gave out, he wouldn't be dragged off or forgotten. He believed the world had taken all it could from him, and now he simply waited for the last bit of strength to slip from his bones. In his mind, life had ended years ago. All that remained was the slow business of dying. It was a Tuesday in early spring when the sound broke the pattern. Amos was halfway through his second cup of coffee when the distant creak of the barn door reached his ears, a soft, deliberate groan that didn't belong to the wind or the cattle. He froze, hand tightening around the mug ears, sharpening like an old wolf scenting danger. No one came to his ranch, not anymore. The townsfolk avoided him, and trespassers usually met the barrel of his rifle before they made it past the gate. He stood slowly, the joints in his knees protesting as he grabbed the Winchester from beside the door and stepped down onto the porch. The breeze carried the scent of hay horse sweat and something else fear, maybe. He crossed the dusty yard with caution, boots crunching against gravel, the barn looming like a weathered monument ahead. When he pushed open the heavy door, rifle raised, what he saw made him hesitate in a way he hadn't in years. There, standing in the center of the barn with dust filtering through the slats above her, was a young girl no more than 11. Clothes torn, face smeared with dirt, eyes wide but unflinching. She didn't speak. She didn't run. She simply stared at him, frozen like a deer before the shot. The air between them hung thick with tension, but it wasn't the kind Amos was used to, the kind that came before a gunfight or when a rattler coiled near your boots. This was different. This was the quiet weight of something broken, trying not to shatter. The girl didn't make a sound, not a whimper, not a breath too loud. Her silence wasn't shy, it was practiced. Amos could see it in her posture, the way she clutched something crumpled in her small fist, the way her eyes searched his mouth, not his eyes like she was reading the shape of his words before he even spoke. Outside, the wind passed through the barn slats like a ghost, and Amos felt the strange sensation of his own heartbeat, louder than he remembered it being in years. This place, this life, had been quiet for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to have another soul inside it. He'd built his days around stillness, accepted that each sunrise brought nothing new. And yet now, standing here with this child who looked like she'd survived a war, he realized that stillness could be shattered not by a bullet, but by a presence, by a question he hadn't asked himself in decades. What if I'm not alone anymore? She stepped forward slowly, her boots barely making a sound on the dirt floor, and held out the crumpled paper like it weighed more than her. Amos didn't lower the rifle, not yet, but something in her eyes made his finger ease off the trigger. There was fear in them, sure, but not of him. It was a deeper fear, the kind carved into a person by betrayal and loss. Her hand trembled as she offered the note, and Amos took it carefully, his knuckles grazing hers. The paper was soft with wear, the handwriting shaky and frantic. Please help Clementine. Bad men took her mama. She can't hear or speak. Don't trust anyone in town. They're coming. Amos read it twice, then looked at her again, Clementine. She was watching his lips, not blinking. She was deaf, just like the note said. But more than that, she was alone. Utterly, terribly alone in a way Amos understood all too well. And that's when something cracked, not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and deep like ice breaking beneath old snow. For the first time in years, Amos felt something other than numbness. Not hope exactly, but purpose. Maybe there was still one thing worth standing for. And maybe it had just walked into his barn. She couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds, but the way she stood, shoulders rigid, jaw set, reminded Amos of the wild colts he used to break, full of fear, full of fire and holding on for dear life. Her name, Clementine, sounded old-fashioned in a way that fit her quiet, strong out of time. Her cheeks were smudged with dirt, her clothes ripped at the seams, and dried blood crusted near her temple. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. But when Amos glanced down at the note again, he realized that everything she needed to say was already there, scrawled in hurried ink, shaking with urgency. Please help Clementine. Bad men took her mama. She can't hear or speak. Don't trust anyone in town. They're coming. It wasn't just a warning, it was a cry for mercy, and it had found its way to the most unlikely doorstep in the Wyoming highlands. Amos felt the weight of it in his calloused hands, the kind of weight that came with decisions, hard ones, decisions that changed the course of a man's life. He looked back at Clementine, and in her wide, waiting eyes, he saw the question she couldn't speak, but had asked with every step she took to get here. Will you help me, or will you turn away like the rest? Amos studied her, and she studied him right back, except not in the way people usually did. Her eyes didn't flinch or dart or search for approval. Instead, they locked on his mouth, tracking each subtle movement of his lips, as if she were trying to decipher a code only she knew. It hit him then, plain and sharp, she was reading him. Literally. Word for word, breath for breath. The note hadn't lied, she couldn't hear, and she couldn't speak, but she understood. Not just sounds or words, but intent. She had the eyes of someone who had learned to survive in a world that didn't wait for her. The kind of girl who'd seen too much, lost too much, and figured out how to make sense of silence better than most people ever made sense of noise. Amos lowered the rifle slowly, the weight of it suddenly too much to carry in the presence of someone so vulnerable, yet so unflinching. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, unsure what words could even begin to mean anything in that moment. Still, Clementine waited not for comfort, not for explanation, but for choice. She was testing him, watching his every syllable like it was a verdict. And for the first time in decades, Amos felt the urge to speak, not just to be heard, but to be understood. The stillness shattered again, not by wind or wildlife, but by the low, steady thrum of hooves crunching dry earth. Amos stiffened every instinct in his aging body, going taut. He moved to the barn wall and peered through a narrow gap in the wooden slats. 3 riders were cresting the ridge dust trailing behind them like smoke. They weren't townsfolk or cattle hands, Amos could tell by their posture, by the casual way they carried their weapons. The lead rider wore a badge glinting on his chest, but Amos didn't need to see it to know who it was. Wade Langston, deputy marshal, or so he called himself. But Amos had watched men long enough to know when someone wore a badge like a costume, not a duty. Langston was slick mean behind the smile, the kind of man who asked too many questions about missing homesteads and burned out farms always a little too late to help. Amos had kept his distance for years, but now Langston was riding straight onto his land, no invitation, no respect. And behind him were 2 others, hard-eyed men with cruel mouths and twitchy fingers. Amos looked at Clementine. Her small hand clutched his sleeve. Her eyes said everything they found me. The horses came to a halt just outside the barn, hooves pawing the dirt, as the riders dismounted with practiced ease. Amos could hear the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, and the slow, deliberate cadence of boots approaching. Langston's voice followed smooth as oiled rope. "Morning, Thatcher," he called out, tone friendly enough to fool a stranger. "Heard there might be a little girl wandering these parts. Round 11, dark hair, might be confused." Amos stepped out, slowly leaning on a pitchfork, masking tension behind his usual scowl. "Only confusion I see is men with badges trespassing on my land," he replied, letting his voice drag like gravel. Langston smiled, but there was no warmth behind it, only calculation. Just trying to help old-timer. Poor thing's all alone. Family had an accident. We're trying to reunite her with what's left. The word accident crawled under Amos's skin. It didn't sound like grief, it sounded like warning. The other 2 men fanned out eyes, sweeping the barn fingers hovering near their belts. They weren't searching. They were hunting, and Amos felt in his gut the terrible truth they didn't come to rescue a child. They came to silence one. Amos didn't waste another second. With a quiet glance toward the hay pile in the far corner, he gave Clementine the barest nod. She understood instantly, slipping behind the grain bins and disappearing beneath an old horse blanket without a sound. For someone so young, she moved like someone who'd hidden many times before. As the first pair of boots crossed the barn threshold, Amos shifted his weight onto the pitchfork and met Langston's approach head-on, his body aching but his eyes sharp. "You don't look like rescue parties I've seen," he muttered. "More like buzzards circling the wrong carcass." Langston laughed softly, glancing around with that mock-casual air of a man who already knew what he was looking for. "Come now, Amos. No need for theatrics, just an old man in a barn, right?" His deputies began kicking through bales and crates, knocking over feed sacks, checking shadows. Amos stepped in their path where he could slow, but deliberate, playing the role of the grumpy recluse the whole town believed him to be. Every second he bought was a lifeline. Clementine didn't need much, just a window. And Amos, though brittle in bone, still had steel in his spine when it counted. The tension thickened like smoke in the rafters. Langston's smile began to crack, revealing the cruelty beneath. "You're not as dumb as the rest of town makes you out to be, Thatcher," he said, stepping in closer, close enough that Amos could smell the whiskey on his breath. "But smart men know when to keep their mouths shut." One of the deputies, a wiry man with a sharp nose and mean eyes, kicked over a barrel and turned toward Langston with a smirk. "What if we just say he died?" he said, not even lowering his voice. "Old man alone on a ranch, heart gives out. Real peaceful like. Folks'd believe it. No one's gonna dig too deep." Langston didn't laugh. He just studied Amos, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver like it was part of his arm. "Wouldn't take much," he murmured. "One bad fall. One misunderstanding." Amos stared him down, the pitchfork still clutched in his gnarled hands. His chest was tight, not from fear, but fury, the kind that had been buried under years of silence and grief. These bastards didn't just want the girl, they wanted to erase her. And they were willing to bury him too, just to keep their secrets dead and gone. Langston took one slow step forward, then another until the barrel of his revolver tapped against Amos's chest. "Last chance, old man," he whispered. "Is there a girl here or not?" Amos didn't flinch. His grip on the pitchfork didn't tighten, didn't shake. He simply stared the deputy in the eyes and said, with the calm resolve of a man who'd already made peace with death, "Ain't seen no girl, just ghosts." The thin deputy scoffed. "Then maybe the ghost needs a reminder he ain't dead yet." In a flash, the leather strap in his hand lashed across Amos's shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through joints already stiff with age. Amos staggered but didn't fall. A second hit came slicing across his back, but still he said nothing. Not a curse, not a plea. Langston watched with growing irritation. "Stubborn fool," he spat. "You're gonna die for someone you don't even know." Amos turned his head, slowly wincing. "Ain't about who she is," he rasped. "It's about who you are." In that moment, the moral line was drawn not with words, but with bruises and blood and silence. Amos Thatcher had spent 30 years with nothing left to protect, and now, in the twilight of his life, he finally found someone worth protecting, even if it killed him. While the men tore through the barn with the careless cruelty of scavengers, Clementine remained still beneath the old horse blanket, curled like a field mouse hiding from hawks. But her eyes, sharp alert, were searching for more than safety. Through a narrow gap in the boards just above her, she saw sunlight spilling in bright and steady. With hands that trembled only slightly, she reached into the pocket of her torn coat and pulled out a small metal object, a mirror no bigger than a man's palm, scratched, battered but still capable of catching light. She positioned it carefully, angling it through the slat, flicking flashes of sunlight in a steady rhythm toward the ridge beyond the fields. To the untrained eye, it might seem like nothing, just a shimmer, a trick of the sun. But Clementine had learned how to signal. Her mother had taught her back when survival meant staying hidden but not forgotten. And now, surrounded by men who would kill her if they found her, she wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was sending out a flare, a silent scream, a code. Because somewhere out there, if she was right, someone good was watching. And if she timed it, right help was already on its way. Clementine wasn't trembling from fear anymore. She was focused, calculating a child shaped by danger, but unbroken by it. While the men cursed and kicked through hay bales, her small fingers kept flicking the mirror with perfect rhythm. She wasn't just surviving, she was leading them somewhere. Her escape into Amos's barn hadn't been by chance. She had chosen it. She had known this place sat near the southern ridge where the sun hit clean in the morning, and where a signal could be seen from miles away if someone knew where to look. She didn't know Amos would protect her, but she had prayed someone kind enough might still exist. And now, with Langston barking orders and one of his deputies getting dangerously close to her hiding spot, Clementine stayed calm. She adjusted the angle of the mirror once more, flashing the final part of the signal sequence, then buried the mirror deep into her coat. Her breathing slowed, not from panic, but from preparation. This wasn't a child lost in the wilderness. This was bait with a plan. And Langston, for all his violence and threats, was too blinded by power to realize he was walking straight into a trap set by a deaf little girl with nothing left to lose. Just as Langston barked his next threat and moved toward the back of the barn, a new sound rumbled in from the open plains, the unmistakable thunder of hooves fast and many. Dust kicked up on the horizon, growing thicker by the second. Langston's confidence cracked. He froze, his eyes narrowing as he followed Amos's gaze toward the front. "What the hell is that?" the thin deputy muttered. But Amos already knew. Clementine's signal had worked. Charging through the rising cloud came 6 mounted men, their coats flaring behind them, rifles strapped tight, eyes locked on the barn. And at their head rode a man with silver hair, a hard jaw, and the kind of quiet fury that only decades of service and loss can forge. Deputy Marshal Langston, he called, voice sharp as a bullet. "You've got one chance to lay down your weapon." Langston's hand twitched toward his gun. He'd been found. Langston snarled, grabbed Amos by the collar, and shoved him aside. "Kill them," he screamed, drawing his revolver. The barn exploded into chaos. Bullets tore through the air, splintering beams and sending hay flying. One of the deputies was hit clean through the chest, spinning backward into a pile of tools. The other made a run for the far door, but a rifle cracked outside. Captain Whitmore's shot dropped him mid-stride. Amos crawled through the dust and noise, searching for something, anything that could be a weapon. But in the haze, one thing became clear. The lawless men had lost their edge. Langston was alone now, desperate, wild-eyed, and dangerous. And his target wasn't Whitmore anymore. It was Clementine. Langston dove through a side opening, disappearing out the back of the barn, like a wolf with a scent. Amos staggered to his feet just in time to see it. Langston sprinting through the clearing, heading straight for the fallen log by the creek. And behind it, crouched low and wide-eyed, was Clementine. She stood up the moment she saw him coming. No scream, no sound. Just a flash of fear in her eyes and the kind of courage that belongs to someone who's already lost everything. Langston raised his gun as he closed in. She was his last way out, and he meant to use her. Amos didn't think. He just moved. His legs felt like wood, his chest burned like fire, but his heart beat with purpose. He barreled out of the barn, pitchfork in hand, and tackled Langston before the man could reach the girl. They hit the dirt, hard, rolling through dust and pine needles, fists flying. Langston was stronger, younger, furious. He got on top fast, driving his forearm into Amos's throat, choking the life out of him. "Should have stayed dead, old man," he hissed. But Amos didn't let go. Not this time. Spots clouded Amos's vision. His fingers fumbled through the dirt, closing around the wooden handle of the pitchfork. With everything he had left, grief, fury, love, he swung upward. The tines drove into Langston's chest with a wet crack. The deputy froze, eyes wide with disbelief. "You killed me," he gasped. Amos looked him in the eye. "Yeah," he whispered. "I did." Langston slumped sideways, lifeless. The silence that followed felt holy. Amos fell back in the grass chest, heaving, vision dimming. The fight was over. His body, worn and broken, had nothing left to give. But his soul was light. He could hear footsteps now, feel a small hand take his. Clementine's. She was safe. She was alive. And for the first time in 30 years, Amos Thatcher felt peace. He'd stopped waiting to die. He'd finally chosen to live. The battle had ended, but the final moment was just beginning. Amos lay beneath the fading afternoon sky, his body cradled in the soft grass by the creek. Clementine knelt beside him, her small hand wrapped around his rough, weathered fingers. Tears streamed down her cheeks, silent as always, but full of meaning. Her eyes wide and brimming met his. He could barely breathe, but he squeezed her hand gently in return. Captain Whitmore appeared kneeling beside them. He watched the girl's fingers move quick, soft motions painted in sunlight. "What's she saying?" Amos whispered. Whitmore's voice cracked as he replied, "She says thank you, and that you're her angel." Amos closed his eyes and smiled, his breath ragged, but full of peace. No one had called him anything but crazy in decades. Now he was something else, something better. "There's a box," Amos rasped, "under the floorboards. Bedroom. Gold coins. For her." Whitmore nodded. "We'll find it." "Anything else?" Amos blinked slowly, looking up at the girl. "Tell her. She gave me something. I thought I'd lost." Amos coughed, his voice barely audible now. "A reason to live, even for just one day." Clementine leaned down and pressed her forehead gently to his. Her hand never let go. The warmth of her touch traveled through his skin and into his soul. Amos Thatcher, once forgotten, now mattered. And in that moment he was whole. As the last breath left his lungs, Amos didn't feel pain, he felt release. The weight of loneliness lifted, replaced by something rare connection. He wasn't alone anymore. Captain Whitmore closed Amos's eyes with quiet reverence and removed his hat. Around them, the Rangers bowed their heads, a life lost, a soul redeemed. Later that evening, as the sky turned orange and soft with dusk, Clementine returned to the barn. In her hands was a bundle of wildflowers, lavender daisies, thistle. She placed them on Amos's chest before the burial tares falling silently onto his worn shirt. The Rangers laid him to rest on the hill behind the house, beside the graves of his wife and daughter. For the first time in decades, his family was whole again. Before she left for Silver Creek with Captain Whitmore, Clementine tucked a folded piece of paper under Amos's pillow. On it, in a child's neat handwriting, were the words, "My name is Clementine. I cannot hear your words, but I can see your kindness. An angel taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust a stranger." At sunrise, Clementine climbed onto a horse beside Captain Whitmore. Wrapped in one of Amos's old blankets, she looked back at the ranch, the barn, the hill, the porch, where kindness found her. The house was quiet now, but no longer empty. It was filled with memory, with peace. As they rode away toward a new beginning, the wind whispered through the trees and across the plains. Amos Thatcher had waited 30 years to die, but in one single day he learned how to live, and a deaf child learned to hope again.